As a returning staple to the Diablo franchise, the Barbarian is the prime example of strength, brutality, and weapon mastery. Now in Diablo 4, the Barbarian has undergone some big changes to help add some more complexity to the class, but don't worry, if you are a longtime fan of the Barbarian, you will still feel right at home. So what makes the Barbarian such a devastating class to consider? Well, first, they're going to deal large amounts of damage with their core skills and the additional buffs that are going to support those core skills. They're also the only class that has the Berserking buff, which gives them large increases to damage and movement speed. And speaking of movement, they do have multiple skills to help them navigate the battlefield quickly. So you'll be able to leap, charge, and lunge all across the battlefield, attacking enemies in between. And then lastly, they are a little bit tankier, especially after the damage reduction buff that they received once the beta has concluded. So we do have some increases there. But as with all things, the Barbarians aren't amazing at everything. There's always trade-offs. So while the Barbarian appears to be an absolute force of nature, they also have a few weaknesses to understand. One, they're incredibly resource dependent. Fury is what they're going to use. They don't use mana or anything like that. They use Fury, and it is consumed very, very quickly. So you do need to pay attention to that. They also have longer cooldowns than some of the other classes, which can put a pause on your damage output during extended fights. So in short, they're somewhat bursty, but also you can sort of kind of plan these out and scheme them up. That way they're available when you need them, but just be aware they do have longer cooldowns. They also have a lack of ranged options, so you will spend a lot of time in close range, which puts you more in harm's way. Some people like it, some people don't. And they're also slower early game than other classes, but truly this isn't really anything to worry about. Most classes are slower in the early game, so we don't plan for early game, we plan for end game. So now that we have a handle on what makes and breaks a Barbarian, let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about what makes them truly unique, and that's going to be the arsenal system and their technique slot. But before we do that, I need to tell you about my partnership with Apex Systems. I worked with them to design 3 custom builds that'll give you all the firepower you need to experience Diablo 4 in all of its glory. Now these range from entry-level builds like the Epic, which is an affordable way to get into PC gaming, to the Mythic, which is a high-powered rig that'll ensure Diablo 4 runs like butter, whether you're dungeon diving, fighting world bosses, or slaying players in PvP. Now all of these computers are customizable and they can be financed through a firm, so you don't have to pay the full price today. Instead, you can pay over time and still get the PC immediately to be ready for launch. And to help get this thing kicked off, you can use code Vulkan to save up to $250 off of your next purchase. So check out the link in the description below to get started, but let's get back to the video. So a Barbarian's arsenal system allows them to equip 4 weapons. A 2-handed bludgeoning weapon, a 2-handed slashing weapon, and 2 one-handers that you can dual wield. And as you use these weapon types, you're going to build something called expertise for that type of weapon. So for instance, if you use a 2-handed axe all of the time, then you're going to gain increased damage to vulnerable enemies because you're going to increase your expertise with 2-handed axes. And each weapon type provides a bonus that gets stronger as you build expertise with that weapon type by killing enemies. So for example, one-handed axes are going to give increased critical chance against injured enemies. One-handed maces will give increased damage to stunned enemies. One-handed swords will give lucky hit, which causes a chance to gain fury when hitting crowd-controlled enemies. Polearms will give increased lucky hit chance. Two-handed axes are going to give increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Two-handed swords are going to cause a portion of your damage to inflict bleeding damage to the enemy. And then two-handed maces have a chance to gain fury whenever you hit an enemy. So while this might change over time, you can still see how versatile this system can be, right? It helps build a certain playstyle that you're after. For me, I love bleeds. I love those type of things. So I spent most of my time using two-handed swords. I absolutely loved the extra bleed damage that I would just randomly apply to enemies as I was fighting them. So that's the arsenal system, but that's not everything that the Barbarian gets. At level 15, the Barbarian's going to unlock something called the technique slot. Now, this is a special slot that allows you to choose an expertise that applies no matter what weapon you choose. So if you're someone who really loves axes, but you want that bleed effect of two-handed swords, then you can equip that expertise into the technique slot to get that bonus. So now that we know what makes a barb unique, let's dive into their skills and what they bring to the table. So when it comes to skills for the Barbarian, we do have a wide variety to choose from, and they're divided into 6 categories. So one, we have our basic skills. These are low damage skills. They have 0 cost. They're typically used to regenerate a resource or have an effect of some sort like stuns. We have core skills. These are sort of the motor of your build and your rotation. These are going to consume resources to deal larger amounts of damage and typically hit more enemies per cast. Defensive skills help protect against damage. They provide utility and they crowd control enemies. Brawling skills will add even more utility, including shouts. Weapon mastery skills allow barbarians to unleash sort of like devastating attacks with very long cooldowns. And then ultimate skills are these sort of game-changing high impact skills. They typically possess a long cooldown and only one of these can be chosen. Then we have ultimate passives. These are similar to skills. They're extremely powerful. They're going to define a playstyle of your build, really kind of change things up. But like skills, only one can be chosen at a time. So let's talk about some examples of these skills. So for basic skills, you have something like bash, right? You're bashing your target. Then on the 4th one, you're going to stun the target. You have flay, which is going to flay the enemy, inflicting damage and inflicting bleed. Then for core, you have Hammer of the Ancients, where you slam down your hammer and you deal AoE damage. You have Whirlwind, which is a classic. You're going to spin and you're going to deal damage to nearby enemies. And you have Upheaval, where you're going to tear into the ground and then fling debris forward. Defensive abilities, couple examples here. We have Ground Stomp. You're going to deal damage and stun enemies. And you have Rallying Cry. You're going to shout and grant allies increased movement speed and resource regeneration. Then Brawling is the next one we talked about. Kick is going to kick and knock back enemies. And then enemies that are kicked in terrain will actually take increased damage and they'll be stunned. So you can kick an enemy into like a cliff face and they'll actually take extra damage, get stunned, and open them up for some pretty cool attacks. Then we have Leap. Leap's going to allow you to leap forward and slam down, dealing damage and knocking back enemies. Next, we have Weapon Mastery. First, we have Death Blow. This is going to deal a large amount of damage to enemies in front of you. And if you kill an enemy with this skill, the cooldown is reset. And then we have Rupture. Skewer enemies in front of you, dealing damage, and then rip out your weapon, additionally dealing damage for a total bleed amount, and then removing all bleeds from them. And then for our ultimate skills, we have 3. We have Call of the Ancients, which is going to summon 3 Ancients to help you in battle. Corlick the Ancient will leap at enemies in frenzy. Talik will spin in a whirlwind, and Matawick will upheave the ground and deal damage. Iron Maelstrom is going to attach a chain to your 2-handed mace and slam the ground to stun. You're going to reactivate the skill again to attach a chain to your 2-handed slashing weapon and swipe it to deal damage and apply bleeds to all enemies in front of you. Then you can reactivate it for a 3rd time to attach a chain to your dual-wield weapons and then swing them around to deal extra damage. Lastly, we have Wrath of the Berserker. This is going to cause you to gain berserking and unstoppable for a short duration. Now, during this duration, dealing direct damage with basic skills is going to refresh the duration of berserking, or at least add a little bit to it, and you're going to be able to continue kind of berserking to increase your damage and your movement speed. From a passive standpoint, so our ultimate passives, we have Unconstrained, which is going to increase Berserk's maximum duration by 5 seconds, up from 5, essentially doubling it, and increasing its damage bonus. Walking Arsenal will allow dealing direct damage with 2-handed bludgeoning, 2-handed slashing, or dual weapons. They're going to grant increased damage, and while all 3 skills are active, you're going to gain an additional damage buff. So basically here, if you go out and you deal damage with each weapon type, then you're going to get increased damage. You can stack all of these things up and then get an additional damage buff on top of all of that. So if you're somebody who really loves like stance dancing, that type of stuff, I think Walking Arsenal is going to be a great fit for you. Unbridled Rage. So core skills are going to gain a large damage increase, but they're going to cost double. Very simple, very easy to understand. Higher cost, more damage. Then we have Gushing Wounds. Killing a bleeding enemy will create an explosion that'll inflict bleeds to nearby enemies. For me, this is like my perfect ultimate passive. Again, I'm going to go right back to my bleed style of gameplay. I absolutely love it. So Gushing Wounds is what I'll definitely be going with. So guys, overall, the Barbarian is still the king of brutality. He's going to use Rage, Primal Strength, and Momentum to wipe out hordes of enemies and inflict all kinds of damage. So I want to hear from you. What do you guys think? Is this the class for you? Let me know in the comment section below. If you like Diablo content, please consider liking and subscribing. As always, this has been Vulkan, and I'll talk to you guys next time.